The Blackburn T.4, known more commonly as the Cubaroo, was a particularly large biplane that was designed in the early 1920s. It was developed during a time of great activity in the field of naval aircraft design. World War I had demonstrated how air power could influence the course of the war at sea, and the first use of air-dropped torpedoes against large ships proved that the aircraft could be used as an anti-capital ship weapon. In 1922, the British Air Ministry issued Specification 1622. This called for a long-range torpedo bomber. It had to be capable of carrying a large 21-inch torpedo over a range of 800 miles. Two aircraft manufacturers would submit designs to meet the ministry's specification, Avro and Blackburn. Avro were working on a twin-engine design, but Blackburn designer F.A. Bumpus wanted to build his aircraft around a new prototype engine, one that was being developed by D. Napier and Son. The engine, which was dubbed the Napier Cub, was a very large, very experimental design. It was a liquid-cooled engine that featured 16 cylinders in an X pattern, which comprised of 4 banks of 4 cylinders. It weighed over a tonne, had a total displacement of 3,681 cubic inches, or just over 60 litres, and it produced 1,000 horsepower at 1,800 RPM. The engine had already flown successfully in 1922 in the Avro 549 Aldershot, and Blackburn were confident that it could serve well in their own design. Carrying a 21-inch torpedo in 1922 was no easy feat. They weighed on average 1.5 tons, and it was hoped that this single powerful engine would allow them to keep the design more simple, and thus cheaper, than an equivalent design that utilised 2 smaller, less powerful engines. Bumpus submitted his design, and the ministry awarded a contract for the production of 2 aircraft prototypes at the end of 1922. Work began on the first Cubaroo in 1923 at Blackburn's Olympia Works. During its construction, the plane was shrouded in secrecy, and it was not until August 1924 that select members of the press, the Air Ministry, and some international government representatives were invited to inspect the aircraft for the first time. When it first rolled out of the hangar, the Cubaroo would have been quite the sight to behold, being one of the largest single-engine aircraft in the world at the time. It was built around a central fuselage that comprised of a tubular steel structure, and this structure was then clad in a mixture of stressed fabric and duraluminium panels. The fuselage, which was no less than 11 feet deep at its forward end, occupied almost the entire gap between the wings, but tapered sharply towards the rear. It was built integral with 2 tubular steel girders which projected out on each side. These girders were used to mount the 2 separate undercarriages that were required to support the heavy structure above. They also formed the front and rear spars of the bottom center section of the lower wing, from which 2 more spars rose up at a diagonal angle to connect to the fuselage. This formed a very rigid support structure for the enormous proportions of the front fuselage, which of course was dictated by the size of the Cubaroo's engine. The 2 undercarriages were each fitted with a pair of wheels that had a diameter of 4 feet each, and they were spaced well apart with an unobstructed space for the fitting of the 21-inch torpedo. The rear fuselage was supported on a bungee-sprung tail skid. This was braced to the bottom by 2 slanting struts, and to the top by 2 others lying parallel and external to the sides. A biplane tail unit was chosen, for at the time they were still in high favour due to their structural advantages. It was equipped with 2 normal fins with balanced rudders, a large central rudder, horn-balanced elevators, and variable incidence tailplanes. The 2 main wings of the aircraft were massive, at least by the standards of single-engine aircraft of the day, and they both had a span of 88 feet. They maintained a constant chord of 11 feet 6 inches, and had a slight dihedral to maintain lateral stability. One source also stated that the outer section of the wings also had a slight sweepback, but from the photos I've seen and the aircraft drawings, I think this may not have actually been the case. To reduce the hangar space required to store an aircraft of this size, the outer panels of the wings were hinged to the centre section and could be folded back for storage. In terms of overall dimensions and performance, the Cubaroo had a length of 54 feet, a height of 19 feet 4 inches, and of course, as mentioned earlier, a wingspan of 88 feet. It had an empty weight of 9,632 pounds, and a maximum takeoff weight of 19,020 pounds when carrying the torpedo. When loaded, it had a maximum speed of 115 miles an hour, and an absolute ceiling of 11,800 feet. Its operational range would differ depending on its configuration, but with maximum payload it had a range of 1,800 miles and an endurance of 10 hours. The Cubaroo was operated by a crew of 4, a pilot, a navigator, a bomb aimer who also served as a gunner, and another gunner. The pilot and navigator sat side by side in an open cockpit ahead of the leading edge of the upper wing and over the rear part of the engine. In front of the pilot's windscreen was a curved radiator conforming to the rounded shape of the nose, and it provided a convenient way of warming the cockpit in cold weather. All crew members were in direct communication with each other. A hatch in the floor of the cockpit gave access to an enclosed cabin below that housed the bomb aimer. This cabin was lit by portholes and equipped with wireless equipment, a chart table, and the floor of the cabin incorporated a window for the bomb aimer. It also provided prone positions for 2 gunners firing through rotating trapdoors in the fuselage adjacent to the lower wing route. The rear gunner position could be accessed by a passage that led aft from this cabin. It was housed in an elevated gun ring on top of the rear fuselage that gave a wide field of fire over the tail unit. The Napier Cub engine dominated the front of the aircraft. Though it was built in an X arrangement, it was not completely symmetrical. The upper banks were closer together than the lower banks, being inclined 26 1/4 degrees to the vertical, whereas the lower banks lay 26 1/4 degrees to the horizontal. This feature enabled the designers to enclose the upper portion of the engine completely within the nose, with only the lower cylinder blocks and part of the exhaust being exposed. Despite its size and complexity, the Cub could be cold-started in under 2 minutes thanks to a 5-horsepower gas starter that was installed in the engine bay. After the initial inspection, the Cubaroo was painted in RAF colours and given the serial N166. It flew for the first time in the summer of 1924. At this point, the aircraft was still kept fairly secret, and the first flight was not publicly shown. It was flown by Flight Lieutenant Bowman, who would become well known as the chief test pilot for Hawker in later years. He was chosen as the test pilot because he had previously flown the Avro Aldershot, which had also been powered by the experimental Napier Cub engine. Later on in August, the aircraft would perform a public demonstration flight at Brow. Bowman took off into an 8-knot wind, and according to one onlooker, the aircraft floated into the air in half the available distance of the airstrip. The praise was not limited to those on the ground either. Bowman reported that the aircraft felt very easy to fly, which, considering it was flying at a maximum load weight of 9 tons, including a torpedo, was high praise indeed. During this flight, Bowman put the Cubaroo through a series of slow and fast runs and climbing turns, before conducting a very gentle landing that the plane achieved in under 100 yards. Following this, the Cubaroo then went to Martlesham Heath for official performance trials. Only one change was made during this time, and that was the replacement of its 2-blade wood propeller for a 3-blade adjustable pitch model. A second Cubaroo was built in 1924 and given the serial number N167. It first flew in 1925 and was almost identical to the first, with the exception that the radiator was of a different shape and that it was fitted with a metal 3-blade propeller from the outset. It made a brief appearance at the Hendon RAF display on the 27th of June 1925, where it dwarfed all other aircraft. It greatly impressed onlookers during the main flypass, with its huge size and massive engine providing a symphony of noise that drowned out all others. Despite impressing the public, the press, and several prominent members of the air staff, the Cubaroo would not go into production. Later in 1925, the Air Ministry abandoned its specification for a large bomber to carry the 21-inch torpedo, and at the same time they put more focus on twin-engine aircraft due to their high reliability. In response to this, Blackburn made detailed design studies for twin-engine versions of the Cubaroo that would be powered by the Rolls-Royce Condor engines. However, none of these were built, and the 2 Cubaroo prototypes finished out their days as experimental platforms. The first prototype was written off after its port undercarriage collapsed in 1925, but the second one carried on for another year, being used as a testbed for the experimental Beardmore Simoon 8-cylinder engine.